Welcome to one of Appalachia's scariest cases. Tell us what you think as we investigate this dark, generation-old mystery. It was 1834. West Virginia was not yet a state. However, the mountains that crossed that area had old secrets hidden in fog and silence. Back then, communities were separated by miles of thick forest, and police took days to arrive, where families made their own rules without surveillance. It was common knowledge to avoid steep Greenbrier County houses. More was involved than distance or rough terrain. Thoughts and feelings went further. They hung like fall morning mist. The family lived in a log cabin surrounded by old trees that blocked the sun in this mountainous area for years. Former residents said it was always there. No amount of poverty or loneliness could explain the land's problem. The family patriarch was average-sized with a face and eyes that rarely met. He hunted, cut down trees, and sold furs in nearby villages. His quiet, old-looking wife took care of the property and was rarely seen. They formed a family core that kept outsiders out. They avoided community events and Baptist church services. This family intrigued Macabre for more than just their secrecy. Late summer. 1834 saw many strange events. People taking the dirt road next to their property disappeared. People usually got lost in the Appalachian Mountains. The harsh winters, bears, and rough land damaged it. However, a type began to form, and some noticed. Someone who sold clothes and worked the Lewisburg-White Sulphur Springs Road reported it first. He said in a tavern that he had seen strange people near his family's lonely home at dusk carrying something heavy wrapped in canvas. Few noticed at the time. Tools, firewood, and game were brought into those mountains. However, the merchant claimed those silhouettes were scary. They moved quickly and quietly. A nearby village blacksmith told him that a traveling medicine salesman friend had disappeared after saying he would stay the night. The seller walked with a suitcase full of elixirs and tonics and recent sales money. Nobody saw him again. 2 miles away, his wagon was empty, and the horses ran free in a clearing. No owner was seen. County government searched quickly. Resources were scarce and mountains too big. People were suspicious of a young woman traveling south with her parents. They begged for water at the jailed family's home. Later, the girl said she saw something that made her freeze through a cabin wall crack while her dad was talking to the boss. People's belongings were stacked in a corner. Hats, boots, coats, bags, and more than a poor family living alone should have. When? After she asked, her mother told her to be quiet and ran to the wagon. This report reached the Greenbrier County Sheriff in early fall. He was middle-aged and had handled land disputes and small thefts, but not serious investigations. The high number of disappearances worried travelers on that route. Longer, safer routes replaced that route for traders. Community pressured the sheriff to act. The sheriff took office October 23, 1834, traveled to the remote property with 4 trustworthy men. Due to morning fog and steep terrain, it was hard to see. After finding the cabin, they saw smoke from the chimney, indicating someone was there. As if anticipating their arrival, the patriarch greeted them neutrally. He said he didn't know about the disappearances and let them search the property, expecting nothing. No suspicious items were found during the first check. Found. The young woman said there were things, but the patriarch said he bought them from travelers who needed cash quickly to continue their trip. At the time, this was common. The sheriff left without proof, but promised to monitor the area. The police officer was disturbed by the place, his wife's turn away, and the heavy silence in that dark cabin. Winter arrived early that year, covering thick Appalachian snow. The disappearances stopped, but not because the mystery was solved. Few were brave enough to drive on the icy, dangerous roads. The family was left alone on their land, and for a few months, It looked like the case would be forgotten as another unsolved mystery in that ancient, dark land. Thor discovered things in spring 1835 that would change how people viewed Appalachia for years. A farmer, a man 5 miles from the family's property, was surveying it when his hunting dog started digging quickly next to a creek. The animal smelled something under a thin layer of dirt and dead leaves. After seeing what he saw, the farmer ran away and rode his horse to the nearest village. Bones, tissue, and personal items from different people were mixed in. The weather hadn't destroyed everything yet. Clothing, a rusty pocket watch, and a partially intact leather boot remained. The religious, calm farmer later said he felt a bad energy there, like the earth didn't want to hold on to what it was forced to. The sheriff returned with a larger group, including a Lewisburg doctor who could examine corpses. An investigation followed. It was meticulous for the time. They discovered the creek wasn't isolated after carefully digging around it. Several graves lined the bank for almost a quarter mile. Each hole revealed more disturbing evidence of premature deaths. The doctor found bones from at least 7 people, possibly more. Size and shape indicated adult male bones. Things found. The victims were likely merchants, travelers, or people carrying valuables on the road near the family's home, as the bodies revealed. Documents from a leather wallet found on one body identified it as a missing peddler from August 1834. It was impossible to ignore the connection to the lonely family, distance between graves and property, times people went missing, and description. The victims faced the same dark direction. Sheriff set up a larger operation to check the cabin again. They had permission to search thoroughly. At dawn on April 2nd, 1835, 15 armed men surrounded the property. The father pretended innocence, but tension was palpable. His wife refused to leave the cabin despite being told. The men lifted floorboards and checked every corner of the house. Make a barn by digging around the cabin. Their most surprising discovery was in the basement, a small damp space below the main building. A locked wooden chest was hidden under grain sacks and rusty tools. They found a macabre collection of traveler belongings when they broke the lock. Folded wallets, watches, rings, jewelry, IDs, and personal letters were present. It was like a silent list of lost lives and greed-driven crimes. Something scarier was among them. A handwritten notebook. These were traveler notes, lists of belongings and estimates of value. Even the strongest searchers were shocked by the cold record of horrible things. The entries were made at least 5 years ago, so the crimes were likely ongoing, long before 1834. The patriarch was arrested immediately. His wife told him things that made the situation worse, despite her initial reluctance. She said she was always in danger and had seen horrible things, but she was afraid to run away or tell on her husband. In her testimony, she described how travelers were lured to the property with food, shelter, or directions, but never returned. The method shown. Nighttime ambushes were uncovered through questioning and evidence. People were approached on a nearby road at dusk when visibility was lower. They were welcomed to the property. When alone and without witnesses, they were attacked and their belongings stolen. The bodies were moved in the dark to bury near a stream where soft ground made it easier. The locals were shocked, longtime mountain residents not knowing a predator was present. People who traveled that road at night didn't realize its danger. The story spread quickly through Virginia newspapers to Richmond. The scandal showed how dangerous remote travel routes can be and how difficult it is to maintain order in large, sparsely populated areas. The father was jailed in the county while the crimes were investigated. More property searches were done, and their surroundings. Crime-related axes and knives were strategically hidden. Supplies, canned food, medicines, and travelers' savings were stolen. The trial was scheduled for summer. Lots of excitement. People from abroad came to see the proceedings to bring justice for all the deaths. The small town of Lewisburg's makeshift courtroom barely held the spectators. A rare moment, when police could catch a long-hiding criminal. Strong evidence was presented. Witnesses reported missing people. Experts identified the bones as those of missing people, and the victims' families identified them. The notebook was read aloud in court, shocking and angering everyone. The wife testified that she was terrified living with a killer for years. The wooden walls echoed her shaking voice. Courtroom walls. Most of the trial, the patriarch didn't speak. His face was hidden. He didn't apologize, explain, or ask for forgiveness. He seemed emotionless. He appeared to be driven by greed and opportunity. His court-appointed lawyer only defended him with evidence-chain legalese. The verdict was guilty of multiple murders after 3 days of deliberation. Judge's grave sentence. Hanging to death, he said. On August 15, 1835, a public square would host the execution. This was common at the time to show justice had been done and deter future criminals. In Appalachia, word spread quickly. In the days before the execution, case observers and victims' families visited the county jail. Some came to learn about their loved ones. Being singled out, pain, and a reason other than greed. Only to request food or water did the death row inmates speak. No one cried or begged forgiveness. Everyone was more upset by the heavy silence. A local pastor visited the condemned man in jail several times to offer spiritual comfort. The priest later said he had never seen a soul so closed. Off, unable to accept redemption. It was like trying to reach someone through an impenetrable wall. The patriarch silently listened to the prayers, staring at his cell's iron bars. Neither interested nor sorry. His 20 years in ministry were his most difficult. The family's mountain estate also garnered attention. People who were curious would go there despite police warnings. The log cabin. A sheriff locked the doors, keeping the building empty, but rumors spread. People reported hearing strange sounds from that direction at night. Wind-blown voices and unmarked footsteps were heard. Superstitions are human fear trying to shape the impossible. People still didn't pass after dark. His wife was released after testifying against him. It wasn't clear she was involved in the crimes, but many. Her community distrusted her. She was stranded. A family of religious farmers over 20 meters away took her in. Because she spent years with a monster, she struggled with solitude and rarely leaving her house. Others said she looked 10 years older because her hair was turning white and her face had deep wrinkles. The execution began bright and warm. Lewisburg's central square may have held over 300 people. Traders, farmers, and families gathered to see how this terrible story ended. Virginia newspaper reporters wanted to document everything. The square's center held the event's simple but useful wooden gallows. 6 armed men pulled the death row inmate from jail in a cart. His hands chained. The crowd reacted with anger and morbid curiosity. While some yelled insults, others stood quietly and thought about the man who had caused so much pain. He confidently climbed the wooden steps to the gallows platform. Everyone in the empty square heard the sheriff read the sentence. He described the crimes, victims, and how terrible things had become in those mountains. A tradition that continues today allowed death row inmates to say their last words. When things are dire. He remained motionless, staring at the crowd. He finally spoke. Strangely, he said little. He only said he did what he had to survive in that harsh land, and that the mountain hurt everyone. He didn't apologize or see the humanity in the people he killed. The cold statement shocked the crowd more. The pastor tried to reach him. He bowed spiritually, helpless against this man's darkness. Whoever executed the condemned man put the hood over his head and tied the rope around his neck. After that, only the square's wind broke the silence. The lever was pulled, the trap door opened, and the justice of the day performed its duty quickly. The crowd felt relieved and uneasy. The darkness of their story ended, but what was revealed would haunt that area for decades. Newspapers covered the event extensively in the days that followed. Virginians discussed the case in pubs, churches, and community meetings. It was one of the most notorious early Appalachian crimes. It was scary to realize that bad things can happen anywhere, even in peaceful towns. Local historians wrote about the case, interviewed witnesses, and collected evidence before. Time took it. The execution didn't end the story. Months later, new information emerged. Older travelers reported strange and scary experiences with the lonely family. The merchant said he was invited to stay the night at the house in 1830, but declined because he felt uneasy. This feeling likely saved him. Another man said he saw the patriarch pull something heavy years ago. He didn't think much of walking through the forest at night. Police reviewed files on local missing people from the past decade. This was compared to the evidence and items they had taken from the property. Possible victims increased dramatically. There may have been 20 or 15 over the years, say experts. Many travelers didn't write down their family trees, so there was no way to know. County communication was difficult. The mountain property was empty. Even at ridiculously low prices, no one wanted to buy or live in it. It was thought the land was cursed because it was darker and the birds stopped singing. The cabin's boards rotted and the roof sagged. Humans left holes in the land, which the forest slowly filled with new plants. The body-found stream, also, was permanently marked. Locals avoided it decades later. Mothers forbade their children from going. Even though it took longer, hunters chose different paths. Like an unhealed wound, the land remembered what happened. The area slowly changed after the execution for years. To avoid that dark mountain stretch, part of the old estate road was rerouted. Dealers and, even though it took longer, travelers liked the longer route. The new route temporarily hurt the local economy, but safety outweighed any issues. Nobody knew what started the fire that destroyed the empty cabin in 1837. Residents miles away reported seeing the flames illuminate the night sky with an orange glow through the trees. One morning, people returned home to ash and burning things. A few saw the fire as some believe it is divine cleansing, while others believe it is a physical attempt to remove that stain from the landscape. Truth was impossible to find. The Greenbrier County government kept case files carefully. The investigating sheriff served for 15 years and often had people talk about the Macabre episode. The county office locked up the property's items in a special cabinet. The collection was quiet, provided proof of those terrible events. The executed man's wife lived 12 years longer. She helped out around the house with the farmers who took her in and avoided people. She whispered about the past, as if afraid of bringing back bad memories. She died of fever in 1847. She was devoured in days. She was buried in some simple cemetery. Her tombstone only listed her name and death dates, not her history. Over the years, historians and writers studied the case more. Richmond reporters interviewed living witnesses and examined official records in 1842. His Richmond newspaper article revived the case and cemented it in American crime history. It was. This investigative journalism examines serial crimes. It launched a genre that would become popular decades later. The Lewisburg doctor who examined the Creek bodies returned to work, but the experience changed him. He wrote a chapter about the case in his old age memoirs. He discussed the medical aspects of the investigation and how seeing such clear evidence of cruelty made him feel. Writing, about how it changed his view of people and how civilization could conceal evil. In 1838, the local Baptist church, where some missing travelers had attended, held a memorial service. The community mourned together and realized how terrible the event was. The pastor, who tried to reach the sentenced man, talked to him about forgiveness, redemption, and staying alert. Take care of each other. Everyone in the church cried for the souls lost in those dark mountains, not just the known victims. The streamside graves were marked with simple wooden crosses. Families of victims paid their respects there. A sad, makeshift cemetery was hidden in the trees. Water running and whispered prayers were the only sounds. The crosses fell, but the place's memory endures, kept going among seniors. The rush west intensified in 1845, and many Appalachian families left for new opportunities. Some wanted to start over somewhere different from their recent past to avoid history. Others wanted better farming land and more business opportunities. Regardless, Greenbrier County's population dropped, leaving large parts of the county even more isolated. But not everyone left. Due to a bad man, some natives wouldn't leave. These families worked hard to portray Appalachia as more than that dark chapter. They wanted it to be known for its natural beauty and people strength. Years and decades passed instead of months. Legal scholars relied on case court records. Discussions about investigations included the trial. Procedures, why evidence preservation is important, and questioning people, one of the best documented cases. It demonstrates remote justice system strengths and weaknesses. Law professors sometimes discuss the case in class to demonstrate how legal concepts can be applied. The first road near the old house was slowly overgrown by plants. Middle road forests and trees grew, overtook wagon wheels. The fact that an important trade and travel route had passed through it in less than 10 years was hard to tell. Nature didn't care about human tragedies. It kept changing and renewing the landscape. Hunters and explorers sometimes found buried or forgotten items. An old belt buckle, broken pottery, and rusted metal. Each discovery reminded us that. Under old trees and rich soil were stories of sudden, terrible deaths. Some reported these to police. Others left them because they didn't want to mess with history. The Appalachian region has changed greatly in recent decades. In the years that followed, West Virginia's secession became more political. This was due to economic and social differences between the state's mountain and plantation regions. East. Regional identity and independence discussions included Greenbrier County, with its complicated history and strong people. Though people talked about bigger political issues, that terrible event from 1834 stayed in their minds. A young Charleston lawyer investigated high-profile and mountain unsolved crimes in 1850. He visited several counties, interviewed witnesses, reviewed court records, and wrote reports. Major crimes occurred. After arriving in Greenbrier County, he focused on the family living alone. The lawyer accessed the county clerk's original papers. He spent weeks reviewing every page, note, and statement. The prisoner's notebook, a precise business-like record of his victims' lives, impressed him most. Young lawyer wrote in. He wrote in his journal that he had never seen such clear evidence of a mind without empathy. The lawyer discovered new information during his interviews. He interviewed a 70-year-old man who lived next door to the family and said he had seen strange behavior before the crimes. He rarely saw the patriarch on mountain trails, but he always brought heavy work tools when it wasn't appropriate. Places. He carried axes for hunting and thick ropes for hiking. An older woman who had washed clothes for local families was another key witness. She thought she was only asked to wash clothes once on the remote property in 1832. How many men's clothes didn't look like the house's owner bothered her. Clothing in various sizes and styles. It was clearly better than a mountain family could afford. After asking where the clothes came from, she was paid and sent away, never to return. Some victims' families were found by the lawyer. He found a woman whose brother had disappeared in 1833 while on business in a nearby county. Although the man's body parts were never identified, a watch found on the criminal's property matched the description. The one her brother carried. For years, she hoped he had left to start over. After the crimes were discovered, there was painful certainty. The interviews revealed a pattern the initial investigations missed. The convict was patient and smart about his decisions. He targeted solo travelers with insufficient local connections and enough valuables to pose a threat. Explain risk. It was cold, planned predation, not random violence. The lawyer attempted to write a book from his detailed manuscript. However, publishers thought it was too disturbing for most people. He never published the manuscript. It was found in a family archive years later. After being bridged in the early 1900s, it was a crucial source to U.S. organized and serial crime historians. The crime scene changed slowly. The forest had overrun the cabin site. Young trees replaced a garden, and bushes covered a doorway path. Nature continued its endless cycles of growth and decay, unaffected by the bloodshed, but for those who knew. Despite the story, the place felt unsettling. In 1856, religious people founded a small spiritual retreat a few miles from the old property. They wanted travelers and locals to think and relax. Because the retreat's founders knew the area had a dark past, they wanted to bring light. They provided regular services, safe lodging, and worked to change people's perceptions. Part of Appalachia. The retreat eventually became a local landmark. People planned stops there because they knew they would find genuine hospitality and safety. It was unlike the fake friendliness used as a trap decades earlier. The area's reputation slowly improved, but the stories persisted. The long winters, cold nights around campfires, and whispered conversations in taverns. The tale was repeated. Each tale differed. Some details were omitted or exaggerated. Legends usually began with true events. All of them shared the main truth. Someone in those mountains saw people as obstacles to his material goals. County records were occasionally examined. Read-loving historians, law students, and all the writers looking for material ended up in those dusty archives. Because of their historical significance, the sheriff continued the tradition of carefully preserving the documents after replacing the original investigator. The state archives received copies of the primary records. This way, history would be preserved even if the originals were lost. National tensions rose in the 1850s, foreshadowing wars. Even with this bigger problem, local. In each community, memories and stories were preserved. The case of the family who lived alone had become a part of the region's history, a scar on the landscape that had taught everyone a hard lesson about being alert. How important it is for communities to be connected, and how dangerous it is to be completely alone. When the Civil War started in 1861, it destroyed and split the Appalachian region into many pieces. Like many mountain areas, Greenbrier County was torn between different groups of people who wanted different things. People who had lived next to each other for. People of different generations found themselves on opposite sides of a war that split the country in two. During the war, many old stories were forgotten, including one that had been rumored to be haunting the area for decades. Soldiers from both sides marched along the same roads 30 years ago that travelers had gone missing. In places close to where the isolated estate used to be, military camps were set up. Some of the older soldiers, who were from the area, told their younger soldiers about what happened at Macabre, took place there. The scary stories were a way to pass the time on the long nights of guard duty, a break from the terrible truths of the war going on around them. During the years of war, the county archives had to be moved more than once to keep them from being stolen or destroyed. Thomas Whitmore was a very dedicated record keeper who put his own safety at risk to keep important papers safe. All of the papers related to the 1834 case were in this pile. Whitmore knew that this was. History was an important part of everyone's memory and could not be lost. Even during wartime, the area changed. When peace came back in 1865, it was completely different. A lot of young men never came back from the battlefields. Families were spread out, properties had been abandoned, and the local economy was destroyed. It would take a long time and hurt a lot to rebuild. That being said, old stories started to come up again, like weeds that always find a way to grow through broken concrete. A soldier coming home from war in 1866 chose to live in the same area where the property of the executed criminals used to be. It was almost free land, and he needed a place to start over with his life. Even though neighbors warned him about the bad history of the area, the veteran was realistic. Seeing ghosts from the past didn't bother him because he had seen bad enough things in the war. A few hundred yards away from the old cabin, he built a new one. The vet and his wife put in a lot of work to change the land. They got rid of weeds, planted crops, and set up a small fruit tree farm. The goal was to bring new life to a place that is usually associated with death. People in the neighborhood watched with a mix of admiration and fear. Some people thought it was brave to face the past. Others thought it was so careless that it was almost blasphemous. When the veteran was clearing land, he would sometimes find buried things, like rusty metal pieces, broken pottery, and even an old set of chains. Every new thing he found made him think of the dark history he was building on. Instead of letting himself be bothered, the man gathered these things and gave them to the county authorities, which added to the history of the area. It was his way of remembering the people who died while also moving on. It had been almost 10 years since West Virginia became its own state by 1872. Greenbrier County was slowly getting better after the war. In that year, a college history professor went to the area as part of a larger project to record crimes that happened in Appalachia in the past. He had read the lawyer's unpublished manuscript from decades ago and wanted to check the facts, talk to living witnesses, and visit the sites themselves. The professor stayed on the veteran's land, which looked like a normal farm and was now producing crops. In the evenings, while sitting on the porch of the cabin, the veteran would tell the professor about his time living there. He talked about how in the beginning he didn't trust every sound in the forest and how his wife had a hard time. While they slept, they thought about what had happened on that land. The space became normalized over time, though, thanks to hard work and the stress of farm life. The professor also went to the place where the bodies were found by the stream. It had been almost 40 years, and nature had completely changed the area. There were no longer any marks that the excavations had been done. The wooden crosses were no longer there. The sound of water running was the only thing that stayed, unchanging and eternal. The scholar sat there for hours, trying to remember what he saw, to try to picture what the first discovery was like and how the researchers had done their work with the tools they had at the time. During his stay, the professor was able to talk to 3 people who had seen the execution in 1835. All of them were very old, so their memories were obviously hazy, but the details they remembered were very clear. An 80-year-old woman remembered how the condemned man's face looked blank, as if he wasn't aware of what was going on around him. A man who was 76 years old remembered the heavy silence that fell over the crowd as the sentence was carried out. It was the quietest he had ever heard. An academic article about the professor's work was published in 1874 in a journal that focused on American criminal history. It was the first serious academic study of the case, putting it in the bigger picture of American crime in the 1800s. The professor said the case showed that even in frontiers that seemed disorganized, in societies, justice systems could work well if the people got involved. The article made people think about the case again. Newspapers in Charleston and even states nearby wrote summaries of the story that brought it to the attention of a new generation. A lot of people were shocked to learn that something so horrible had happened in their state. Others, mostly older people in the area, just shook their heads because they remembered hearing the story told orally from generation to generation. In the year 1878, the county chose to put up a small memorial plaque near where the old house used to be. It wasn't meant to honor the criminals. It was meant to honor the victims and show how important history is. The plaque was put up in a way that didn't draw attention to itself. It only said that a tragedy had happened there 100 years ago, and that it should serve as a reminder of how important it is for everyone to be careful and look out for each other. A small group of about 12 people showed up to the ceremony to install the plaque. The soldier, who was still alive, gave a short speech about how history shouldn't be forgotten but also shouldn't make a place what it is to this day. He talked about how honest work could redeem the land and how people who were still alive had a duty to give tragic places new meaning. It was a time for everyone to think about the past and figure out how to include that dark history in their overall identity. The whole Appalachian region went through big changes in the last 20 years of the 1800s. Getting industrialized. Building railroads through the mountains made it possible for people to get to even the most remote areas. New residents moved to Greenbrier County. They came from other parts of the country looking for work in mining and logging. These newcomers didn't know much about the area's history, so they saw the story that had defined the area for so long from a different point of view. A small library was opened in Lewisburg in 1883. The town was still getting back on its feet after the war, so the project was big. The first librarian, a smart man from Baltimore, insisted on adding a section about local history. He asked the county archives for copies of the important papers from the 1834 case. These were carefully typed up and bound to be kept safe and available to the public. This was the first time that anyone who was interested could see the records. When these documents became public, they sparked new interest. Students, amateur writers, and people who were just interested started reading the original accounts. Some people were interested in looking into the case and seeing how the authorities at the time dealt with limited resources. Others looked at the psychological aspects, trying to figure out what kind of person could do such horrible things over and over again for years. It was a sad way to learn, but it was still learning. A young reporter in the area decided in 1887 to write a series of articles about the case again after more than 50 years. He went around the area and used the new camera technology to take pictures of important places. And that was getting easier to get to. The pictures showed that the creek where the bodies were found was now calm and full of green plants. They showed how the area of the old property was turned into a farm. They took them to the square in Lewisburg where the execution had happened. It was now a busy business area. The reporters' pieces came out over a few months and caused a lot of heated debate. Some readers thought it was sad to read the story again. There were also people who said it was important to remember. Watch out. There was a very heated debate about whether or not it was appropriate to include information about the identified victims. Some distant relatives were upset that their family tragedies were being shown to the public. The veteran who had built his farm near the crime scene died of natural causes in 1890. He was 68 years old. The land was passed down to his children, who had grown up there without ever experiencing anything strange or scary. It was just the place where they were born and raised to them, not a place where old crimes still reverberate. It showed how time and everyday life can make even the scariest stories seem less important over time. In the 1890s, as criminology studies at universities in the East became more advanced, they started to use historical cases as research material. At least 2 academic books about the history of police work in the United States talked about the Appalachian case. The authors praised the sheriff and his team for how hard they worked, especially taking into account the limited technology available at the time. The case showed that persistence and close attention to detail could get past technical problems. People in academia started to talk about the interesting idea that being geographically isolated can make crime easier. The case showed how communities that were spread out made it easier for predators to target people, but it also showed how these communities, when brought together, could be effective at finding and punishing criminals. It was a paradox that showed both the weak points and the strengths of rural societies in the 1800s. For the 100th anniversary of the county's founding in 1897, an exhibit on its history was put together. A small part of the exhibit was devoted to the case of 1834, among the other time periods and events that were shown. The organizers made sure to present the information in a respectful way, focusing on justice and community strength instead of the gory details. Some of the first things that were found on the criminal's property, were put on display in glass cases with notes explaining what they meant. A lot of people came to the exhibition, including some descendants of people who were involved in the original case. The sheriff who led the investigation's granddaughter went to the show and was thrilled to see that her grandfather's work was being recognized. She had letters from the sheriff with her that talked about how hard it was on him emotionally to handle the case and how many sleepless nights he had wondering how many. If he had acted faster, the people he hurt could have been saved. After that, these letters were given to the local library. In the late 1800s, people also thought more broadly about what justice and punishment mean. In most states, the system of public executions had been thrown out and replaced with more private methods. When people thought about the execution of 1835, they agreed that while it showed that justice had been done, it was also cruel to make someone's death a public spectacle, even if it was for a good reason. This person had been convicted of a crime. In his memoirs, a pastor who worked in the area in the 1890s talked about how he used the case to talk about morality and the choices people make. He was careful not to make the crime seem good, but he used the story to show how small decisions and excuses can lead someone down darker and darker paths. For him, the case was a reminder that everyone needed to keep working on their morals and that no one was safe from becoming corrupt inside. Around the turn of the century, the area. It has changed, but it is still linked to its past. The mountains didn't change. The stream kept flowing forever, but the people who lived there had passed down from generation to generation many times. History was understood in different ways by each generation, based on their own culture and morals. What didn't change was the knowledge that something important had happened there, something to remember. In the 1900s, a local historian wrote a short book that was only about the case. It's a mix of fiction and real events, meant to make them more understandable to a wider audience. The book sold a fair number of copies over time and became something of a minor classic in local writing. People who lived in Greenbrier County in the future would read it as kids and learn about the bad things that happened there in the past. At the beginning of the 20th century, modernization spread to all parts of Appalachia, even the most remote ones. Cars started to show up on dirt roads, slowly taking the place of horse-drawn. Wagons, adding electricity to bigger cities and the telephone, which made talking to people possible that would have taken days or weeks before. The way communities worked, and by extension, how crimes could be investigated and stopped, changed a lot because of these changes in technology. In 1907, a criminologist from the University of Pennsylvania went to the area just to look into the case. He was working on a theory about how violent crimes happen in groups. and the Appalachian case was a great example of it. To do his research, he was in the area for 3 weeks and looked at all the records that were there, talked to the descendants of those involved, and went to sites that were important. His work led to a monograph that has been used for decades in the study of crime. The criminologist was most interested in the part about planned predation. Unlike violent crimes of passion or acts done on the spur of the moment, this case showed long-term planning and careful victim choice. He saw patterns that would only become more common. Decades later, criminology recognized the choice of weak victims, the creation of a safe place to stay, and the use of a fake normalcy to draw in targets. It was like the prisoner in 1834 had made an unwritten guide to predators that wouldn't be studied in a formal way until almost 100 years later. There were a lot of young men from the area who left to fight in World War I. Some never came back, leaving homes empty and families in grief. One of these soldiers was the great-grandson of one of the people who died in the first case. He had a letter with him that was written by his great-grandfather just a few days before he went missing. In it, his great-grandfather was hopeful about the future of business and loved his faraway family. The soldier was killed in action in France in 1918, and the letter was given to the Louisburg Library. It is now one of the few personal items from a victim that has been kept alive. Some parts of the country did well in the 1920s, but the mountains of West Virginia stayed away from major economic changes. Trends. Life went on at its own pace, which was set more by the seasons and farming than by financial markets far away. In this situation, old stories that have been passed down from generation to generation as part of the local identity were still important. In 1924, exactly 90 years after the crimes, the Louisburg Library put together an exhibit to remember them. Yes, it wasn't a party, but a recognition that almost 100 years had passed since those terrible events. There were old photos in the exhibition, copies of the original papers, maps of the area that show where important places are, and a full timeline of what happened. The unique thing about the exhibition was that it included bigger historical context, showing how the case fit into the history of the country and the region as a whole. One interesting part of the exhibit was a section that looked at how the case changed how police worked in the area in the decades that followed. Greenbrier County was one of the first places in the area to set up official methods for looking into disappearances that were directly influenced by what was learned in 1834. Traveler records were kept more carefully, communication between neighboring counties got better, and there was an informal network of reliable informants who told the authorities about any strange behavior. The 1930s Great Depression was very bad for the economy across the whole country, and the Appalachians were no different. Many historians have pointed out that even though there was a lot of poverty and hopelessness during this time, a corresponding rise in violent crimes that are very bad in the area. Many thought this was because of the close ties between people in the community that had been built over many years, in part because of bad things that had happened in the past. Communities were careful because they remembered what happened when people were alone, and bad things could grow. In 1935, exactly 100 years after the execution, people in the area took a moment to think about what had happened. Several newspapers wrote articles about the past, and sermons in local churches talked about truth, forgiveness, and remembering. At the cemetery where some of the identified victims were buried after their bodies were found decades earlier, there was a memorial service. Family members from far away came, and for many, it was the first time they heard the whole story of their ancestors. During this 100th anniversary, there was an interesting discussion about how to properly remember terrible events. Some people said that remembering the victims and staying alert to similar crimes were important ways to honor them. Some thought that it had been 100 years long enough to let the past rest. Even though no one agreed, The debate itself showed how much the community had grown in its ability to deal with past trauma. Some young people left the area again during World War II and never came back. But those who came back had new experiences that changed how they saw things that were happening in the area. They had seen horrible industrial crimes and atrocities that made the crimes of one man in 1834 seem less horrible, which makes sense given their small size. Even though they were still horrible, the way people thought about violence and evil had changed because of what was going on in the world. In 1948, after the war, a veteran decided to make a personal project of writing up information about all of Greenbrier County's important historical sites. The area linked to the crimes in 1834 was, of course, one of these sites. He made very detailed maps, took pictures, and wrote about history. His work was finally published as a historical guide to the county. It became a source for researchers and people who were just interested. In the 1950s, things got better economically, and TV first came out. Producers became interested in crime stories from the past, and the Appalachian case was thought about for an episode of a documentary series. But after talking with leaders in the local community, the project was shelved. People thought that turning the tragedy into something fun to watch on TV would be disrespectful to both the people who were hurt and the community that had worked for more than 100 years to get over that dark spot in its history. The farm that used to be on the site of the old criminal property is still being run by the third generation of the veteran's family who first owned it. The story was familiar to the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who worked that land, but it felt like something from the past, not from today. With pride, they farmed the land, raised their families there, and went about their daily lives. It could have been the most genuine way for that place to be blessed again. Deep cultural changes happened in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. These changes could be felt even in the most remote parts of Appalachia. The counterculture, the civil rights movement, and issues of power and fairness all had an effect on how younger people understood stories from the past. People began to look at the 1834 case in a different way, not just as a story of crime and punishment, but also as a study of power. The social structures that let tragedies happen and being alone. In 1963, a graduate student in sociology chose the case as the subject of her thesis. She was interested in how people in rural areas dealt with trauma that affected many generations at once. She moved to Lewisburg and lived there for 6 months, talking to people of all ages and backgrounds. Even though it had been more than 100 years, her research showed that the case was still having an effect on local culture in ways that most people weren't even aware of. Understand, the researcher found some interesting patterns. Families in the area were more likely to be wary of strangers than families in similar areas that didn't have the same history. There was a bigger focus on real hospitality in the culture, almost as a response to the false hospitality that had been used as a trap in the past. Most of the stories about the case came from older women, who used them to warn younger women about the risks of trusting what they see. It was the result of generations of trauma. It does things in subtle but persistent ways. In the 1970s, there was a renewed interest in true crime stories, which led some writers to look at old cases again. In 1974, an investigative reporter wrote a book about famous crimes and unsolved crimes in Appalachia. The 1834 case was broken down into 3 chapters and was shown in great detail, with photos of places from the time and interviews with the descendants of both the investigators and the victims. The book got good reviews from critics and brought the story to life. To people across the country, for the first time in decades, there were both good and bad effects on the local community from the book's fame. On the one hand, it brought in curious tourists who spent money in the area. On the other hand, some people didn't like how the historical tragedy had been turned into a tourist attraction. The Lewisburg Library said that a lot more people were asking to see the historical records. In an interview at the time, the county sheriff said that researchers called him once a week, people who want to write or even make movies about the story of interest. A small regional publisher put out a book of letters and papers related to the case in 1978. Many of them had never been published before. There was correspondence between the original sheriff and authorities in neighboring counties in these papers. It showed how hard it is to coordinate investigations when people are far away and can't talk to each other. There were also letters from the families of the victims thanking the authorities for their work. Served, and a deep sense of sadness for the lives lost. These papers added a human touch to the story that accounts of facts alone could not. In the 1980s, new technologies for forensic investigations came out. Forensic anthropologists at West Virginia University said they would like to look at the bodies again using modern methods that might show things that weren't possible in the 1800s. But most of the bodies had been buried for a long time, and some people in the community didn't like the idea of getting in their way again. Most people agreed that the victims had been through enough and should be left to rest in peace. In 1984, 150 years after the crimes, there was a very important ceremony to remember them. It wasn't like other memorials because it was more about reflection than going over the specifics of the case. Near the spot where the bodies were found by the stream, a simple memorial was built. The writing was short and polite. It only said that people who had been hurt by crimes in the middle of the 9th century had been found there, and that their memory served as a reminder of how important it is for communities to be caring and alert. A little over 100 people showed up for the ceremony. The governor of West Virginia gave a short speech about how the state had changed since those dark days in terms of law enforcement and protecting its citizens. Local historians gave talks that put the case in the context of the region's history as a whole. Both known and unknown victims were remembered with a moment of silence, whose stories were lost and never found. In the 1990s, the Internet made historical information more accessible. Local history enthusiasts created Appalachian history websites, and the 1834 case was inevitable. Some sites were respectful and well-researched, while others were biased and false. In response, the Lewisburg Library created an official website with scanned documents and checked information to maintain control, story, and verify its accuracy. A solo documentary filmmaker was allowed to make a short film about the case in 1995. He collaborated with community leaders and historians to ensure a respectful and educational outcome. The 30-minute film focused on criminal history and community healing across generations. An educational broadcaster bought it after regional film festivals. A small but interested audience attended. The late. The Appalachians changed greatly in the 20th century, but they were still deeply connected to that dark history. The mountains persisted. The stream went in one direction forever, but everything else changed. Paving dirt trails into roads. Instant messaging replaced weeks-long letters. A diversified economy replaced subsistence farming. However, some things persisted. How important community is, how we must protect each other, and of preserving history despite hardship. Local culture adopted the 1834 case. It was a defining story about fragile people and strong communities. The area had learned to honor that dark chapter without forgetting or being defined by it. History seemed to be reclaiming its place in the new millennium. Not an open wound or shame kept hidden anymore. Understood and placed a piece of history. Kids who learned about history knew its importance without being traumatized. Through teaching and respectful remembering, living history was preserved. The 21st century changed how people preserved and understood history. Digital technologies have made it possible to preserve and share historical records in ways that past generations never imagined. Since 2004, Lewisburg, The library began a massive digitization project of 1834 case papers. Every page, record, and historical photo was scanned and organized into a digital archive for global researchers. Documents lost for decades were found during digitization. The first property search in 1835 included a man who kept a journal. His notes vividly described what it was like to assembling the evidence and discussing their feelings. He described months of nightmares, how they changed his view of people, and how he prayed every night for the unknown victims' souls. In 2010, almost 180 years after the crimes, a forensic anthropology professor suggested using modern mapping and soil analysis to find more burial sites. Idea caused an angry neighborhood argument. Some said it was crucial to find all victims so they could be treated and identified. Others thought it was best to forget the past and move on since so much time had passed. They believed new discoveries would harm rather than help. After months of discussion, a cautious agreement was reached. A non-invasive investigation could use ground-penetrating radar and other non-digging technologies. Okay then, if important, it would be discussed. As part of the investigation, experts used cutting-edge tools to map the creek and old property in the summer of 2011. The results were intriguing and troubling. The radar found 3 more strange objects in the ground that resembled ancient burial sites. There were also signs that the disposal area had grown. The findings showed. However, without digging, it was impossible to know what was buried. The community quietly marked the areas and left them, knowing some questions were better left unanswered. Local artist made a memorial piece for the county museum in 2015. This thoughtful piece combined historical details with modern thoughts on memory, violence, and justice. It included silhouettes of known victims and blank spaces for unnamed victims. Visitors were asked to deposit small stones in containers. Respect and recognition were intended. It was surprising how popular the installation was. It resonated with people seeking to process that story and historical trauma. In the 1920s, true crime podcasts ruled. Several producers contacted Greenbrier County officials. Permission to discuss the old case. The community established clear rules after mixed experiences with shows that overemphasized the story. The producers worked with local historical consultants, promised to present the case respectfully and accurately, and donated money to preserve historical records. Some accepted these terms, while others sought stories for reuse. People avoided each other more during the 2020 pandemic. On global groups. Over time, Greenbrier County seniors noticed troubling similarities to 1834 history. The past was remembered by forced isolation, mistrust of strangers, and difficulty maintaining community ties. But there were also key differences. Today's technology allows remote communication. Community support systems were unheard of in the 19th century. They helped the weak. It reminded me of our progress, made despite human flaws. A local high school used case studies to teach history, ethics, and critical thinking in 2023. Students examined first-hand sources, evaluated evidence, considered different perspectives, and considered difficult moral issues. The project was designed to teach without being annoying and focus on research and big ideas. Fairness and community matter. State recognized it as an excellent school. People in the region still remember 1834, even in 2019. Although the wound is closed, the story is still remembered. This deeper regional identity educates without defining, scares without teaching, and remembers without consuming. Good and bad stories abound in the Appalachians. Absolute darkness. However, its darkness makes it ideal for learning. The stream where the first remains were found flows. Since ancient times, Cool, clear water has flowed from the mountains. The banks are shaded by old trees. Lots of birds sing in its branches. Life has eternal cycles. Most visitors come for the peace and natural beauty, but some come for the history. It shows that even terrible places can be revived. Try to improve. People remember. They carefully bring the past into the present. The fifth generation of the same family runs the old estate farm. Evil plans were made in kids' playfields almost 2 centuries ago. A quiet victory of light over darkness, of everyday life over terrible historical events. When taught age-appropriately, these kids know their country's history, what it means. They follow their dreams, live fully, and build futures that honor the past without being constrained by it. This trip through one of the worst Appalachian times is over. This story teaches us to be careful, how important community is, and how being alone can make bad things happen. It also teaches us about strength, fairness, and how generations can work together to turn tragedy into meaning and darkness into light. Smarts. We remember the 1834 deaths. Even though they broke up, their stories keep playing, reminding us how precious life is and how we must protect each other. If this journey through Appalachia's dark history touched you, subscribe to the channel for more stories about the mysteries and tragedies that shaped America. Share your thoughts on how communities should handle historical records. An ordeal. Your local stories are welcome too. If you learned about history from this content, please like it. More people will learn about the past and what it teaches us about ourselves.